What if everything you thought you knew about human limitations was wrong? What if the very thing that made someone seem weak was actually their greatest strength? This is the story of Marian Scott, a woman whose supposed disability became the foundation for one of the most impossible shots in military history. A shot that would silence every doubter, rewrite the rules of what's possible, and prove that sometimes, seeing less allows you to aim better. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert air at Fort Carson hung thick with pre-dawn humidity as Marian Scott's battered Toyota Camry rolled through the main gate. The security guard barely glanced at her military ID, his attention already shifting to the convoy of black SUVs behind her. She didn't blame him. Compared to the expensive vehicles carrying the other candidates to the elite sniper selection course, her decade-old sedan looked like it had taken a wrong turn from a used car lot. Marian parked in the far corner of the designated area, her car dwarfed by the massive pickup trucks and tactical vehicles that surrounded it. Through her thick-rimmed glasses, she watched as men in pristine combat fatigues emerged from their rides, unloading cases of equipment that probably cost more than her annual salary as a supply clerk at Fort Bragg. The morning light caught the lenses of her glasses, creating brief flares that made her squint and adjust the frames yet again. She sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel with hands that bore small scars from years of mechanical work. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "Marian, girl, the world's gonna tell you what you can't do based on what they see, but they don't see what matters. They don't see what's inside that head of yours." At 26, Marian had spent 8 years in the Army as a logistics specialist, watching from the sidelines as the combat roles she'd dreamed of remained perpetually out of reach. Every application for sniper school had been rejected. Every request for combat training denied. Her personnel file contained the same recurring note: visual acuity below minimum standards for precision shooting roles. The irony wasn't lost on her. She wore thick glasses that made her look more like a librarian than a soldier, her prescription so strong that removing them rendered the world beyond arm's reach into an impressionist painting of blurred shapes and colors. Yet here she was, having somehow slipped through the cracks of a bureaucratic system that had finally, accidentally, approved her application for the most elite marksmanship program in the military. Marian stepped out of her car, her standard-issue boots crunching on the gravel. She wore the same basic Army combat uniform as everyone else, but on her slight 5'4" frame, it seemed to hang differently, less imposing, more functional. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, revealing a face that was pretty in an understated way, dominated by those thick glasses that had defined her appearance since childhood. She reached into her back seat and pulled out a single duffel bag and a worn rifle case that had belonged to her grandfather. The case was old-fashioned hard plastic, scratched and faded from decades of use, with several bumper stickers from long-forgotten shooting competitions still clinging to its surface. Compared to the sleek modern equipment containers being wheeled around her, it looked like a relic from another era. "You lost, miss?" The voice belonged to a mountain of a man unloading what appeared to be a small arsenal from the back of a lifted Ford F-350. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, according to the name tape on his uniform, stood well over 6 feet tall with arms that strained against his sleeves. His tone wasn't malicious, just genuinely confused about why someone who looked like Marian would be in a place like this. "No, Sergeant," Marian replied quietly, adjusting her glasses again. "I'm here for the selection course." Williams paused in his unpacking, a custom rifle case suspended halfway between his truck and the ground. He looked her up and down, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching concern. "You sure you got the right place? The admin building's back that way if you're looking for a desk job." Before Marian could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Well, I'll be damned." Captain Derek Thompson approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. His uniform was immaculate, his gear clearly top of the line, and his entire bearing suggested military competence refined by years of success. "Looks like they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel these days." Thompson's comment drew the attention of several other candidates who had been organizing their equipment nearby. They formed a loose semicircle around Marian, not overtly threatening but clearly curious about the anomaly in their midst. "I mean no disrespect," Thompson continued, his tone suggesting otherwise. But this is elite sniper selection, the most demanding marksmanship program in the military. We're talking about shots at distances where most people can barely see the target, even with perfect vision. He gestured toward her glasses with barely concealed incredulity. How exactly do you plan to manage that when you can't see past your own nose without those things? Marian felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the same flush she'd experienced countless times throughout her military career. But she'd learned long ago that reactions only fed this kind of behavior. "I plan to do my best, sir," she said evenly. "Your best?" Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison chimed in, having overheard from his position near a tactical vehicle that looked like it belonged to a SWAT team. "Lady, this isn't about participation trophies. This is about life and death. Out there," he gestured toward the training ranges visible in the distance, "lives depend on precision. One missed shot, one moment of uncertainty, and good soldiers die." The circle of candidates had grown larger, drawn by the unusual spectacle of questioning the qualifications of someone who clearly didn't fit their preconceptions of what an elite sniper should look like. Some seemed genuinely curious, others openly skeptical, and a few appeared to be enjoying the impromptu entertainment. Marian glanced around at the faces surrounding her, recognizing the familiar dynamic she'd encountered throughout her career. She was the outsider, the anomaly, the person who didn't belong, but something felt different this time. Perhaps it was the weight of her grandfather's rifle case in her hand, or the memory of the countless hours they'd spent together on his ranch, but she found herself standing a little straighter. "Look," said Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes, a lean man with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in combat zones. "I'm sure you're a fine soldier, but this program has a 90% washout rate, even for guys with perfect vision and years of combat experience. The physical demands alone." He trailed off, looking at her slight frame with obvious doubt. "The mental pressure is unlike anything you've experienced," added Captain Thompson, warming to his theme. "We're talking about making precision shots under extreme stress, often in conditions where visibility is limited and the margin for error is measured in millimeters. It's not a game, and it's not a place for social experiments." Marian adjusted her rifle case to her other hand, the familiar weight of her grandfather's Remington 700 somehow reassuring through the worn plastic. "I understand the stakes, sir," she said quietly. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't think I could handle them." Her response drew a few chuckles from the assembled group. Staff Sergeant Williams shook his head with what might have been sympathy. "Kid, handling them and being capable of elite-level performance are two very different things. This isn't basic training where everyone gets to try their best and hope for the better. This is about identifying the top 1% of marksmen in the entire military." "And frankly," Captain Thompson added, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being right, "the top 1% doesn't need corrective lenses to see what they're shooting at." The group began to disperse as the official briefing time approached, but Marian caught fragments of conversation that weren't meant for her ears. Words like liability, waste of time, and "who approved this?" followed her as she made her way toward the registration building. The registration process itself was a masterclass in bureaucratic indifference, mixed with barely concealed skepticism. The clerk behind the desk, a tired-looking sergeant who'd clearly processed hundreds of similar applications, did a double-take when Marian approached. "Name?" he asked, fingers poised over his keyboard. "Scott, Marian. Serial number?" "Yeah, I got it," the sergeant interrupted, squinting at his computer screen. "Says here you're a supply specialist at Bragg. That right?" "Yes, Sergeant." He looked up at her, then back at his screen, then at her again. "You sure you're in the right place? This is elite sniper selection, not administrative training." "I'm in the right place." The sergeant shrugged and printed out her temporary identification badge and room assignment. As he handed them over, he leaned slightly across the counter. "Look, no offense, but I've been doing this for 5 years. I've seen all types come through here. Rangers, Special Forces, Marine Scout snipers, guys who've been shooting competitively since they could hold a rifle. Most of them wash out in the first week." He glanced meaningfully at her glasses. "Just maybe have a backup plan, you know." Marian took her paperwork and headed toward the barracks, her grandfather's rifle case seeming heavier with each step. As she walked, she passed groups of candidates discussing their backgrounds, their equipment, their expectations for the program. She heard stories of military careers built around marksmanship, civilian shooting competitions won, and years of specialized training. Her own story felt increasingly inadequate by comparison. She'd learned to shoot on her grandfather's small ranch in rural Montana, using iron sights on an old bolt-action rifle, while other kids her age were playing video games. Her grandfather, Thomas Scott, had been a Marine sniper in Vietnam, but he'd never talked much about the war. Instead, he'd focused on teaching her the fundamentals: breathing, trigger control, and most importantly, the mental discipline required for precision shooting. But those childhood lessons on a small ranch seemed woefully insufficient preparation for what lay ahead. As she found her assigned room in the Spartan barracks, a basic concrete block building with narrow windows and institutional furniture, Marian began to wonder if everyone else was right. Maybe she was in over her head. Maybe her glasses really were an insurmountable obstacle. Maybe she'd somehow deluded herself into thinking she belonged in a world designed for people fundamentally different from her. She set her grandfather's rifle case on the narrow cot and sat beside it, the weight of doubt settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. Through the small window, she could see other candidates still unloading their equipment, their confidence and competence evident in every movement. For the first time since receiving her acceptance letter, Marian Scott allowed herself to consider the possibility that everyone else might be right, that she really didn't belong here, and that her presence was nothing more than an administrative error that would be corrected as soon as the real training began. But as the sun set over Fort Carson, casting long shadows across the training facilities that would soon test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine, Marian made a decision. She would stay. She would try. And if she was gonna fail, it wouldn't be because she gave up, before the shooting even started. She had no idea that her real test was still to come, or that the very limitation everyone saw as her greatest weakness would soon become her most powerful advantage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The 0500 Hours Formation was a study in military precision and barely concealed hostility. 43 candidates stood in perfect rows on the concrete apron outside the training facility, their breath visible in the cold pre-dawn air of the Colorado mountains. Marian found herself positioned in the back row, not by choice but by the subtle maneuvering of her fellow candidates who seemed to collectively decide she didn't belong in the front with the real soldiers. Ho, sir. Master Sergeant Cole Richards emerged from the training facility like a force of nature. At 6'2" with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could cut through steel, he commanded attention without saying a word. His uniform bore the patches of multiple deployments, and his weathered face suggested decades of military service in the most demanding roles. When he spoke, the assembled candidates snapped to attention with military precision. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the formation, "welcome to Hell Week. For the next 7 days, we will test every aspect of your ability to function as an elite marksman. Physical fitness, mental toughness, technical knowledge, and above all, your capacity to deliver precise fire under the most demanding conditions imaginable." His eyes swept across the formation, pausing briefly on each candidate. When his gaze reached Marian, positioned behind the much taller men in front of her, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite confusion, not quite disapproval, but something that suggested he was looking at a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture he expected to see. "However," Richards continued, his tone growing more serious, "before we begin the formal assessment process, we need to address what appears to be an administrative error." The formation remained perfectly still, but Marian felt 42 pairs of eyes trying to locate the source of the problem. "It seems that someone has been incorrectly enrolled in this program despite failing to meet basic visual acuity requirements." The words hit Marian like a physical blow. Around her, she could sense the subtle shifts in posture as her fellow candidates realized who Richards was talking about. The morning air suddenly felt colder, and her thick glasses seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds on her face. "Scott, Marian," Richards called out, "front and center." The walk from the back row to the front of the formation felt like the longest journey of Marian's life. Her boots clicked against the concrete with mechanical precision, but inside, her heart was hammering against her ribs. She could feel the stares of every candidate burning into her back, could practically hear their thoughts. Finally, someone's going to fix this mistake. She stopped 3 feet in front of Master Sergeant Richards and rendered a crisp salute. "Specialist Scott reporting, Master Sergeant." Richards didn't return the salute immediately. Instead, he studied her with the intensity of someone examining a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. "Specialist Scott," he said finally, his voice carrying clearly enough for the entire formation to hear. "According to your military records, you require corrective lenses with a prescription of -8 diopters. Is that correct?" "Yes, Master Sergeant." "And you're aware that the minimum visual acuity requirement for this program is 20/20 uncorrected vision?" Marian's throat felt like sandpaper, but she managed to respond. "I was not made aware of that specific requirement, Master Sergeant." A ripple of barely suppressed laughter ran through the formation behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know that Captain Thompson and his allies were probably smirking with satisfaction. This was exactly what they'd expected, the system correcting its mistake before any real training could begin. Richards pulled a tablet from his cargo pocket and scrolled through what appeared to be Marian's personnel file. "It says here you're a supply specialist at Fort Bragg. No combat experience, no specialized marksmanship training, no advanced military education." He looked up from the tablet, his expression suggesting he was dealing with a bureaucratic nightmare. "Can you explain to me how someone with your background and physical limitations managed to get approved for the most elite sniper program in the United States military?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Marian could feel the weight of expectation from every person on that concrete apron. They all wanted to hear her admit that she'd somehow gamed the system, that she didn't belong, that this was all a terrible mistake that could now be corrected. "I applied through normal channels, Master Sergeant," she said quietly. "I met all the requirements listed in the application materials." "The requirements you saw," Richards corrected, his voice taking on an edge that suggested his patience was wearing thin. "But not the actual requirements for someone who might be expected to engage targets at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters in conditions where visibility is limited, and the margin for error is measured in millimeters." "ECAs." Behind her, Marian could hear whispered comments that weren't quite insubordinate enough to warrant official attention but were clearly audible enough to make their point. Words like waste of time, politically correct nonsense, and someone's going to get people killed drifted across the formation. Richards stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Marian could hear clearly. "Look, Scott, I don't know how this happened, and frankly, I don't care. What I care about is that 42 highly qualified soldiers are here to compete for a limited number of spots in a program that could mean the difference between life and death in combat situations." He paused, studying her face with clinical detachment. "I can't in good conscience allow someone with your limitations to continue in a program where failure could result in American casualties." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Marian had expected skepticism, even hostility, but the cold, clinical dismissal of her capabilities based solely on her vision felt like a fundamental rejection of everything she'd worked toward. "However," Richards continued, stepping back to address the entire formation again, "military regulations require that I give every enrolled candidate the opportunity to demonstrate cause why they should remain in the program." His tone suggested he considered this a pointless formality. "Specialist Scott, you have 30 seconds to convince me that someone who can't see past their own hand without corrective lenses has any business in an elite sniper program." The silence that followed was absolute. 42 men waited to hear her admit defeat, to acknowledge that she was in over her head, to thank everyone for their time, and quietly disappear back to her supply depot at Fort Bragg. Even the morning birds seemed to have stopped singing, as if nature itself was waiting for her response. Marian adjusted her glasses, a nervous habit she'd developed over years of feeling scrutinized, and tried to organize thoughts that seemed to be scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Everything she wanted to say seemed inadequate in the face of such overwhelming skepticism. How could she explain that her grandfather had taught her to see things differently? How could she make them understand that limitation and inability weren't the same thing? "Master Sergeant," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "my grandfather always told me that the best marksmen don't just see with their eyes. They see with their minds." She paused, aware that her words were probably sounding like desperate philosophy to men who dealt in concrete realities. "I know I don't look like what you expect a sniper to look like. I know my vision isn't perfect. but I also know that I've never missed a target I've committed to hitting." The claim drew a snort of derision from somewhere in the formation behind her. Someone, she thought it might be Staff Sergeant Morrison, muttered something about basement ranges and paper targets. Richards raised an eyebrow. "Never missed a target? That's a bold claim, Specialist. What kind of ranges are we talking about?" "Up to 800 meters, Master Sergeant. Iron sights only." This time the laughter from the formation was more open. Captain Thompson's voice carried clearly in the morning air. 800 meters with iron sights? On what planet?" Richards held up a hand for silence, but his expression suggested he shared the skepticism. "Specialist Scott, I appreciate your confidence, but 800 meters with iron sights requires a level of precision that, frankly, that most people with perfect vision can't achieve consistently." He looked down at his tablet again, scrolling through what appeared to be additional information. "Your military marksmanship scores are listed as expert level, but those were achieved at standard qualification ranges of 300 meters or less." "Yes, Master Sergeant." "And you seriously expect me to believe that someone who needs glasses to see clearly beyond arm's length can consistently hit targets at 800 meters using iron sights?" Marian felt the familiar heat rising in her cheeks, but this time it wasn't just embarrassment, it was frustration. She'd spent her entire military career having her capabilities questioned, based on assumptions about what she could or couldn't do. She'd accepted the limitations, worked within the system, and tried to prove herself through quiet competence. But standing here, facing the culmination of everything she'd worked toward, she realized that quiet acceptance wasn't going to be enough. "I don't expect you to believe anything, Master Sergeant," she said, her voice carrying a new edge. "I expect you to let me prove what I can do." Richard studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Behind her, the formation remained silent, but she could feel the tension crackling like electricity. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well, Specialist Scott. You want to prove what you can do?" He gestured toward the training ranges visible in the distance. "Range 4 has targets set up at various distances, including 800 meters. You'll have one opportunity to demonstrate your claimed abilities under the observation of myself and the other instructors." His tone suggested he was humoring a child. "If you can hit a target at 800 meters using iron sights, you can continue with the program. If you can't—" "I understand, Master Sergeant." "Excellent," Richards turned to address the formation. "Gentlemen, it appears we're going to have a brief demonstration before we begin our formal training schedule. Consider this an object lesson in the importance of honest self-assessment and realistic expectations." As the formation began to move toward the range complex, Marian found herself walking alone. The other candidates had formed loose groups, their conversation animated by the prospect of watching what they clearly expected to be a spectacular failure. She caught fragments of their discussions, betting pools on how badly she would miss, speculation about what kind of administrative chaos had led to her enrollment, and general amusement at the idea that someone who looked like a librarian thought she could compete with elite soldiers. Captain Thompson fell into step beside her, his expression a mixture of condescension and what might have been genuine concern. "Look, Scott," he said quietly, "I know this seems harsh, but we're trying to save you from a bigger humiliation down the road. This program breaks people who are far better prepared than you are. There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." Marian adjusted her rifle case to her other shoulder. "I appreciate the concern, sir. Do you really think you can make this shot?" For the first time since the formation began, Marian allowed herself a small smile. "I guess we're about to find out." Thompson shook his head and quickened his pace to catch up with his friends, leaving Marian to walk the remaining distance to range 4 alone. As she moved through the morning mist that clung to the mountainous terrain, she could feel the weight of her grandfather's rifle case and the heavier weight of 43 pairs of eyes that expected to watch her fail. But somewhere in the back of her mind she could hear Thomas Scott's voice from all those years ago on his Montana ranch. "Marian girl, the world's gonna tell you what you can't do. But they don't know what you know. They don't see what you see. And sometimes the things that make you different are the very things that make you dangerous." Range 4 was about to find out just how dangerous Marian Scott could be. Range 4 stretched across a natural valley between two ridges, with targets positioned at various distances from 100 meters out to the maximum 800-meter mark. The morning sun had burned off most of the mist, revealing the stark beauty of the Colorado landscape and the intimidating reality of what Marian was about to attempt. The 800-meter target appeared impossibly small even through the high-powered spotting scopes the instructors were setting up. Marian knelt beside her grandfather's rifle case, her fingers working the familiar latches that had been opened countless times over the decades. The case opened with a soft click, revealing the weapon that had defined so much of her childhood. The Remington 700 lay nested in custom-cut foam, its walnut stock worn smooth by years of handling, the metal surfaces showing the patina of age but maintained with meticulous care. "Well, I'll be damned," came a voice from behind her. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, one of the program instructors, had approached while she was unpacking. He knelt beside the case, his expression shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. "Is that an original M40? Marian looked up, surprised by the change in tone. "It's based on the M40 platform, yes. My grandfather modified it himself." Torres whistled low, his experienced eye taking in details that the other candidates had missed. "This is Vietnam-era configuration. Look at that barrel bedding, the trigger work. This isn't some sporting rifle, this is a genuine sniper weapon system." He glanced at Marian with new respect. "Who was your grandfather?" "Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Scott, 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines." The name hit Torres like a physical blow. He rocked back on his heels, his eyes widening with recognition. "Tommy Scott? Tommy Ghost Scott?" When Marian nodded, Torres let out a long breath. "Holy shit! Excuse me, holy cow, your grandfather is Tommy Scott?" The conversation had drawn the attention of Master Sergeant Richards, who approached with obvious curiosity. "Problem here, Torres?" "No problem, Master Sergeant. It's just, do you know who this rifle belonged to?" Richards examined the weapon with professional interest, noting the modifications and the careful maintenance. "Looks like a well-maintained M40 variant. What's the significance?" Torres stood up, his demeanor completely transformed. "Master Sergeant, this rifle belonged to Tommy Ghost Scott, Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Scott, Force Recon Vietnam." He paused, letting the significance sink in. 93 confirmed kills in 2 tours. He was a legend in the sniper community. The effect on the assembled group was immediate and dramatic. The casual conversation stopped, and several of the candidates moved closer to get a better look at the rifle that had suddenly become a piece of military history. Even Captain Thompson approached, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by grudging curiosity. Richards picked up the rifle with the reverence due to a museum piece, examining the scope mounts and custom trigger work. "I've heard the stories about Ghost Scott," he said quietly. "They say he could hit targets other snipers couldn't even see." He looked at Marian with new eyes. "This was really his personal weapon?" "He carried it for both tours," Marian confirmed. "After he came home, he spent years perfecting the modifications. He said every rifle was a work in progress, that you never stopped learning how to make it shoot better." Staff Sergeant Morrison, who had been one of her most vocal critics earlier, stepped forward with obvious fascination. "The Ghost Scott stories are legendary in sniper schools. There's one about a shot he made in the Mekong Delta, 1,200 meters through jungle canopy in monsoon conditions. Command thought it was impossible until they found the target." "He never talked much about the war," Marian said, carefully checking the rifle's action. "But he spent hours teaching me about the technical aspects. Ballistics, wind reading, the mathematics of long-range shooting." She looked up at the assembled group, noting how the dynamic had shifted. "He always said that shooting was 10% equipment, 20% skill, and 70% understanding what you couldn't see." Torres shook his head in amazement. "We studied some of his techniques at the Advanced Marksmanship Unit. The way he could read environmental conditions, compensate for variables that other shooters didn't even consider." He trailed off, studying Marian's face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "He taught you to shoot?" "Every summer from age 8 to 18. 3 hours every morning before the heat got too bad." Marian's voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness. "He died 2 years ago. Left me the rifle and about 40 notebooks full of shooting data, environmental calculations, and what he called lessons the Army doesn't teach." The revelation had transformed the entire atmosphere around Range 4. The candidates who had been preparing to watch her humiliation were now looking at her with something approaching respect. This wasn't just some supply clerk with thick glasses. This was the granddaughter of one of the most legendary snipers in military history, trained personally by the man himself. Captain Thompson, however, wasn't ready to concede the point entirely. "Look, I respect the heritage," he said, though his tone had lost some of its earlier edge. Ghost Scott was undoubtedly one of the best. But genetics and family history don't automatically transfer marksmanship skills, and they certainly don't overcome basic physical limitations. He gestured toward Marian's glasses. "Your grandfather had perfect vision. That was part of what made him effective. You're dealing with a significant handicap that he never faced." Master Sergeant Richards nodded thoughtfully. Thompson raises a valid point. Respect for your grandfather's service aside, this program requires capabilities that can't be taught or inherited. They have to be demonstrated under controlled conditions. Marian finished her rifle inspection and began loading rounds into the magazine. The ammunition was also part of her grandfather's legacy, hand-loaded cartridges that he'd prepared with obsessive precision, each one measured and calibrated for optimal performance in this specific rifle. "I understand, Master Sergeant, and I appreciate that everyone's willing to give me a chance to prove myself." She stood up, slinging the rifle across her shoulder with movements that spoke of years of practice. The weapon seemed to belong there, as if it had found its way home after years of waiting. "But I should probably mention something my grandfather taught me about vision and shooting." Richards raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "He always said that the best snipers don't shoot what they see. They shoot what they know is there." Marian adjusted her glasses, but this time the gesture seemed less nervous and more deliberate. Perfect eyesight can actually be a limitation if you rely on it too much. You start trusting what you can see instead of understanding what you should be hitting. Torres leaned forward with interest. "Explain that." "At long range, environmental factors matter more than visual clarity," Marian continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting lessons learned through repetition. "Wind speed and direction, temperature gradients, barometric pressure, humidity levels. All of these affect bullet trajectory in ways that have nothing to do with how clearly you can see the target." She pointed toward the 800-meter target, barely visible in the distance. "Right now, I can see that target well enough to know where it is. But more importantly, I can read the wind patterns in the grass between here and there. I can feel the temperature difference between the shade and the sunlight. And I can calculate how those factors will affect my bullet's flight path." Staff Sergeant Morrison looked skeptical. "You can calculate all that just by looking?" "Not by looking," Marian corrected, "by understanding. My grandfather spent 10 years teaching me to read environments the way other people read books. Every blade of grass, every temperature shift, every change in air pressure tells a story about what's happening in the space between the rifle and the target." She opened a small notebook that had been tucked inside the rifle case, one of her grandfather's journals, filled with decades of handwritten observations about shooting in various conditions. He documented everything: wind patterns at different times of day, how altitude affects ballistics, the way temperature inversions change bullet trajectory. This notebook contains more practical shooting knowledge than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Richards examined a few pages of the notebook, his expression showing growing respect for the meticulous documentation. "These calculations, they're incredibly detailed. Weather conditions, ammunition performance, environmental factors. This is graduate-level ballistics work." "He had a degree in mechanical engineering before he enlisted," Marian explained. "Said the military taught him to shoot, but engineering taught him to understand why bullets go where they go." The group fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about inherited marksmanship or family legacy. Marian had been trained in a systematic scientific approach to long-range shooting that went far beyond the standard military curriculum. Torres shook his head in amazement. "So when you said you'd never missed a target, you committed to hitting?" "I meant I'd never taken a shot without understanding all the variables that would affect its outcome," Marian finished. "My grandfather taught me never to shoot unless I was certain of the result. He said hope was for soldiers, but certainty was for snipers." Captain Thompson was quiet for a long moment, clearly reassessing everything he thought he knew about the slight woman with thick glasses who had somehow ended up in their elite program. Finally, he spoke. "All right, Scott. I'll admit your background is more impressive than any of us realized. But theory and practice are different things. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you can't apply it under pressure, then let's find out," Master Sergeant Richards interrupted. He gestured toward the 800-meter firing position. Scott, you've got one shot to prove that everything you've just told us is more than just talk. Miss, and you're on the next transport back to Fort Bragg. Hit the target, and you've earned the right to continue with the program." Marian nodded, shouldering her grandfather's rifle with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. As she walked toward the firing line, she could hear Thomas Scott's voice in her memory, as clear as if he were standing beside her. "Remember, Marian girl, the target is just geography. The real shooting happens in your mind." Behind her, 42 of the military's best marksmen prepared to watch her either validate everything she'd claimed or confirm their original assessment that she didn't belong among them. None of them realized they were about to witness the beginning of something that would change everything they thought they knew about the art of precision shooting. Marian's successful 800-meter shot had accomplished something she hadn't expected. It had made her a threat. The bullet had struck dead center of the target, witnessed by every instructor and candidate present. The shot had been so precise that Master Sergeant Richards himself had walked down range to verify the impact, returning with a grudging nod of confirmation that silenced the skeptics, at least temporarily. But as the formal training program began over the following days, Marian discovered that proving herself capable had only escalated the hostility she faced. During the first week of selection, candidates were evaluated on everything from physical fitness and tactical knowledge to equipment maintenance and stress response. What should have been a straightforward assessment process became a gauntlet of deliberate obstacles designed to break her resolve. It started with the equipment inspections. Every morning at 0530 hours, candidates were required to present their gear for examination by the instructors. Standard military procedure called for random inspections, but Marian found herself selected for detailed examination every single day. While other candidates received cursory glances at their equipment, her rifle, scope, ammunition, and personal gear were subjected to microscopic scrutiny. "Scott, your scope mounting screws are loose," announced Instructor Staff Sergeant Kevin Walsh on the third morning, wielding a small torque wrench like a weapon. "Safety violation. You'll need to have this re-inspected before you're cleared for range time." Marian knew her equipment was properly maintained. She'd checked every component twice the night before. But arguing with an instructor was a guaranteed way to earn dismissal from the program. She spent 45 minutes retightening screws that were already within proper specifications, missing the morning chow period and arriving late to the first training session. The pattern continued with increasing creativity. Her ammunition was declared non-standard because it was hand-loaded, despite being identical in specifications to military-issue rounds. Her shooting position was critiqued for being unconventional, even though it was producing better results than most candidates achieved. Her thick glasses were repeatedly cited as a potential safety hazard that might shatter under recoil, requiring her to undergo additional eye protection testing. Captain Thompson had emerged as the unofficial leader of what could only be described as a systematic campaign to drive her out of the program. Unlike the crude harassment she'd faced on arrival, his approach was calculated and professional, always operating within the boundaries of regulation while maximizing psychological pressure. "The thing is, Scott," Thompson explained during a break between training exercises, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of someone offering helpful advice, "this program isn't just about individual performance. It's about team cohesion and reliability under extreme stress." He gestured toward the other candidates, who were cleaning their weapons in efficient silence. "These men need to know they can depend on their partners in life-or-death situations. When you're different, when you stand out, it creates doubt." His words were carefully chosen to sound like legitimate military concern rather than personal bias. "I'm not saying you can't shoot," he continued, "but shooting is only part of what we do here. There's physical fitness, tactical movement, equipment reliability, and most importantly, the ability to function as part of a unit without becoming a liability." The physical fitness tests became exercises in creative interpretation. While the official standards were clearly defined, Marian found herself subjected to additional safety assessments that other candidates didn't face. Her performance on obstacle courses was measured against stricter criteria. Her ruck march times were questioned despite meeting all requirements. Even her medical evaluations were subjected to enhanced scrutiny, with particular attention paid to her vision correction and whether it might fail under combat conditions. Staff Sergeant Morrison, who had initially shown interest in her grandfather's legacy, became increasingly vocal about practical concerns. "Look, "I respect Scott's service," he said during a group equipment maintenance session, "but this isn't Vietnam, and we're not training museum curators." Modern sniper operations require integration with advanced technology, night vision systems, digital communications, all of which can be compromised by dependence on corrective lenses. His comments drew nods of agreement from several candidates. The logic was superficially reasonable, which made it more dangerous than outright hostility. "What happens if her glasses get broken in the field?" asked Sergeant Williams, the massive candidate who had first questioned her presence. "What happens if we're operating in conditions where traditional eyewear isn't compatible with required equipment?" These conversations always took place when instructors weren't present, but their conclusions somehow found their way into official evaluations. Marian began noticing references in her daily assessment reports to equipment compatibility concerns and integration challenges that weren't reflected in her actual performance scores. The psychological pressure was constant and multifaceted. During tactical exercises, she was repeatedly assigned to teams with the least cooperative candidates. Communication protocols somehow always broke down when she was involved, leading to mission failures that were attributed to coordination problems. Her shooting positions were inadvertently compromised by teammates who needed to move equipment or adjust their own setups, always with apologetic explanations about spacing requirements or safety protocols. No, the most insidious aspect of the campaign was its deniability. Every incident could be explained as a misunderstanding, a safety concern, or a legitimate training requirement. When Marian's personal gear was accidentally soaked during a river crossing exercise, it was attributed to equipment failure rather than the convenient slip of her rope handler. When her assigned sleeping area in the barracks was repeatedly disturbed by late-night, equipment maintenance activities, it was explained as necessary preparation for the next day's training. Captain Thompson orchestrated these incidents with the skill of someone experienced in managing personnel conflicts. He was never directly involved, always maintaining plausible deniability while encouraging an atmosphere where accidents and misunderstandings seemed to cluster around Marian with suspicious frequency. "The pressure is intentional," he explained to a group of candidates during a rare moment when he thought she was out of earshot. Elite sniper operations involve extreme stress, hostile teammates, unreliable equipment, and conditions where any weakness becomes magnified. If she can't handle this environment, she'll be a liability in the field. The argument was persuasive because it contained elements of truth. Sniper operations did involve extreme stress and hostile conditions. Elite military units did need to identify and eliminate weak links before they could endanger missions. The selection process was designed to be brutal and unforgiving. But what Thompson's reasoning ignored was the difference between legitimate stress testing and targeted harassment. While other candidates faced the same physical and mental challenges, they weren't subjected to the constant barrage of equipment failures, administrative obstacles, and social isolation that had become Marian's daily reality. The breaking point came during the night vision training exercise. Candidates were required to engage targets at various distances using night vision equipment in complete darkness. The exercise was designed to test their ability to adapt to low-light conditions and operate effectively when visual references were limited. For most candidates, night vision goggles provided a technological advantage that enhanced their natural capabilities. For Marian, the equipment created a complex challenge. Her prescription glasses didn't fit properly under the night vision apparatus, creating gaps that allowed ambient light to interfere with the image. The depth perception required for accurate shooting was compromised by the interaction between her corrective lenses and the electronic display. "Equipment malfunction," announced Instructor Walsh when Marian's first shot missed the target by several inches. "Scott, your night vision setup is non-standard. You'll need to recalibrate before continuing." The recalibration process involved adjusting the focus and alignment of the night vision device while wearing her glasses, a procedure that took nearly 20 minutes and required assistance from technical personnel. By the time she was cleared to resume shooting, other candidates had completed their exercises and were preparing for the next phase of training. Time penalty, Walsh noted on his evaluation sheet, inability to efficiently operate standard equipment under field conditions. The assessment was technically accurate but ignored the fundamental compatibility problem between her vision correction and the military standard night vision system. Other candidates with minor vision problems were provided alternative equipment or adjustment procedures. Marian was expected to overcome the limitations through individual effort and adaptation. As she finally lined up for her delayed shooting exercise, Marian could hear whispered conversations among the candidates waiting for their next assignment. The words liability, special accommodation, and safety risk carried clearly in the still night air. Even candidates who had previously shown her respect were beginning to question whether someone who required special considerations for basic equipment could function effectively in an elite unit. But what none of them realized, what the systematic harassment and deliberate obstacles had failed to account for, was that Marian had been training for exactly these conditions her entire life. Her grandfather hadn't just taught her to shoot in perfect daylight with ideal equipment. He had prepared her for situations where technology failed, where conditions were hostile, and where success depended not on having advantages but on overcoming disadvantages. As she settled into her shooting position, her thick glasses reflecting the faint starlight, Marian remembered one of Thomas Scott's most important lessons. The enemy doesn't just want to kill you, Marian girl. They want to break your spirit first. They want you to doubt yourself, to second-guess your training, to believe that you don't belong. But the moment you let them get inside your head is the moment you've already lost. Through her night vision scope, the distant target was barely visible as a dim geometric shape against the darker background. The equipment problems, the time pressure, and the whispered doubts of her fellow candidates faded into background noise as she began the mental calculations that would determine where her bullet needed to go. The hostility was escalating, but so was her resolve. They had no idea what they were up against. The mess hall at Fort Carson was typically divided into invisible territories during the evening meal. Senior candidates clustered near the windows, instructors maintained their own section, and the various cliques that had formed during training carved out their respective spaces. Marian had grown accustomed to eating alone, her presence at any table somehow causing conversations to die and chairs to be needed elsewhere. She was methodically working through her meal, reviewing ballistics calculations in her grandfather's notebook, when someone sat down across from her without invitation. Looking up through her thick glasses, she found herself face to face with Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Chen, one of the program's senior instructors who had remained notably absent from the harassment campaign that had defined her experience. Chen was different from the other instructors. Smaller in stature but carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, he bore the weathered look of a career soldier who had seen actual combat rather than just training exercises. His uniform displayed patches from multiple deployments, and his eyes held the kind of awareness that suggested he missed very little of what happened around him. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, though he was already settling into his seat with the casual assumption of someone accustomed to being welcome wherever he chose to sit. "Of course not, Chief," Marian replied, closing her notebook and giving him her full attention. In her experience, when senior instructors sought out individual conversations, it usually meant significant news, and lately, significant news had rarely been positive. Chen opened his own meal, but didn't immediately begin eating. Instead, he studied Marian with the same careful attention she'd seen him apply to target analysis during range exercises. "How are you finding the program so far, Scott?" The question was loaded with implications. They both knew that her experience had been far from typical, but Chen's tone suggested he was looking for something more than the standard, challenging but rewarding response that military protocol usually demanded. "It's been educational, Chief," she said carefully. "I'm learning a lot about advanced techniques and equipment." Chen's slight smile suggested he appreciated both her discretion and the understatement. "I'm sure you are. I've been watching your performance evaluations, and they present an interesting picture." He pulled a small tablet from his cargo pocket and scrolled through what appeared to be official training records. "Your shooting scores are consistently in the top 5%. Your equipment knowledge tests are nearly perfect. Your physical fitness marks meet or exceed all standards." He paused, looking up from the tablet with an expression that suggested he was building toward a point. "But your peer evaluation scores and instructor assessments tell a different story. Concerns about team integration, equipment compatibility issues, questions about performance under stress." He set the tablet aside and leaned forward slightly. "That's a curious disconnect, wouldn't you say?" Marian felt a familiar tension building in her shoulders. This conversation could go several directions, and most of them led to her dismissal from the program. I'm doing my best to address any legitimate concerns, Chief. I'm sure you are. Chen finally began eating, but his attention remained focused on her. You know, I've been an instructor in this program for 8 years. I've seen every type of candidate you can imagine. Hotshots who thought their combat experience guaranteed success. Technical experts who knew everything about ballistics but couldn't hit a barn. Physical specimens who couldn't handle the mental pressure. He took a sip of coffee, organizing his thoughts. But I've never seen someone face the level of systematic obstacles you've encountered while maintaining your performance standards. The directness of the comment caught Marian off guard. Throughout her ordeal, everyone had maintained the fiction that her experiences were either normal parts of the selection process or unfortunate coincidences. Chen was the first person to acknowledge openly that something unusual was happening. I appreciate your observation, Chief, she said cautiously, but I understood that the selection process was designed to be challenging in multiple dimensions. Chen nodded approvingly. Diplomatic answer. And you're absolutely right. This program is designed to identify and eliminate candidates who can't handle extreme pressure. We simulate hostile conditions, equipment failures, team conflicts, and individual challenges that candidates might face in actual operations. He leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. But there's a difference between legitimate stress testing and targeted harassment designed to force a specific outcome. The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. Marian felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting, Chief. I think you understand perfectly. Chen's voice dropped to a level that wouldn't carry to nearby tables. I think you've understood from day one that certain people in this program decided you don't belong here, and they've been working systematically to prove their point regardless of your actual performance. He pulled out his tablet again, scrolling through additional screens of data. Equipment inspections. You've been selected for detailed examination every day for 2 weeks. Statistically, that's about a 1 in 10,000 probability if selections were truly random. He continued scrolling. Training partner assignments. You've been paired with the least cooperative candidates for every team exercise. Again, mathematically unlikely to be coincidental. Marian stared at him, hardly believing that someone in authority was finally acknowledging what she'd been experiencing. Chief, I don't want to make accusations or complaints. I just want to complete the program and prove that I can do the job. I know you do. Chen's expression softened slightly. And that's exactly why I'm having this conversation. You see, Scott, I knew your grandfather. The statement hit Marian like a physical blow. She'd assumed that Sergeant Torres was the only person in the program with knowledge of her family history, but Chen's comment suggested a more direct connection. You knew him? She managed. Tommy Scott saved my life in 1987, Chen said quietly. Not in Vietnam. This was years later, during a training accident at Quantico. I was a young Marine, cocky as hell, and I made a stupid mistake during a live-fire exercise. Your grandfather was there as a civilian contractor, helping to develop new marksmanship techniques. He paused, the memory clearly vivid in his mind. When I got pinned down by my own team's misdirected fire, he crawled 200 meters under hostile conditions to reach my position. Took him 3 hours to get me out safely. Chen took another sip of coffee, his eyes focused on something beyond the mess hall walls. Afterward, he bought me a beer and gave me the best advice I ever received about being a sniper. He said, son, the most dangerous enemy isn't the one trying to kill you, it's the one trying to convince you that you can't do the job. He looked directly at Marian. He was talking about self-doubt, but the principle applies to any force that tries to undermine your confidence. The implications of Chen's story were becoming clear. He told you about his granddaughter. He mentioned you every time I saw him over the years. Talked about your training, your natural ability, your dedication to perfecting the techniques he'd taught you. Chen smiled. He also mentioned that you'd faced challenges that had nothing to do with your shooting ability, said the military wasn't always good at recognizing unconventional excellence. Battery. Marian felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Her grandfather had believed in her enough to discuss her potential with his military contacts, but he'd also understood the obstacles she would face. Chief, what are you telling me? Chen closed his tablet and leaned forward again, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering classified information. I'm telling you that certain people in this program have decided to make your failure their personal mission. They're operating within the technical boundaries of regulations, but they're violating the spirit of fair evaluation. He paused. And I'm also telling you that not everyone agrees with their approach. What does that mean practically? It means you have allies, even if we can't always act openly. Chen glanced around the mess hall, noting the various groups of candidates and instructors. It means that some of us are keeping detailed records of every irregular incident, every biased evaluation, every suspicious coincidence that's affected your training. He lowered his voice further. And it means that when the time comes for final evaluations, those records will be part of the official assessment. Marian felt a surge of hope mixed with caution. But in the meantime, you keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Perform at the highest level, maintain your professionalism, and don't give them any legitimate reasons to dismiss you. Chen stood up, preparing to leave. But also remember what your grandfather taught you about reading conditions that other people miss. The political environment here is just another set of variables to account for in your calculations. As he turned to go, Chen paused and looked back at her. One more thing, Scott. The final evaluation exercise is being modified. Instead of the standard daylight precision test, they're implementing a new night shooting protocol. Extreme low-light conditions, extended range, single shot to determine final rankings. Marian's pulse quickened. Night shooting had been her biggest challenge during training, primarily due to the equipment compatibility issues with her glasses. When is this happening, Chief? 3 days. They're calling it a test of adaptability under unconventional conditions. Chen's expression suggested he understood the implications. Interesting timing, considering your recent performance issues with night vision equipment. After he left, Marian sat alone in the mess hall, processing everything Chen had told her. She had an ally in the program, someone who understood both her capabilities and the obstacles she faced. But she also had confirmation that the final test was being specifically designed to exploit her greatest weakness. She opened her grandfather's notebook to a section she'd rarely consulted, his notes on low-light shooting techniques developed during his Vietnam tours. The pages were filled with observations about natural night vision, alternative sighting methods, and psychological techniques for maintaining precision when visual references were limited. At the bottom of one page, in his careful handwriting, she found a note that seemed written directly for this moment. Marian, when they try to use your limitations against you, remember that limitations are just another form of intelligence. The question isn't whether you can see well enough to hit the target. The question is whether you understand the target well enough to hit it in the dark. 3 days to prepare for a test that would determine not just her place in the program, but whether everything her grandfather had taught her about overcoming impossible odds was true. She had never needed those lessons more. The equipment room at Fort Carson resembled a high-tech armory crossed with a research laboratory. Rows of precision rifles lined the walls, their custom configurations representing decades of advancement in military marksmanship technology. Night vision systems, thermal imaging devices, computerized ballistics calculators, and communication equipment filled specialized storage units, each piece representing thousands of dollars in cutting-edge military hardware. Marian stood before the night vision section, studying the various systems available for the final evaluation. Standard ANSTVS-14 monocular devices, binocular ANSTVS-15 units, and the latest generation thermal imaging scopes were arranged in neat rows, each with detailed specification sheets describing their capabilities and limitations. For most candidates, this equipment represented technological advantages that would enhance their natural abilities and provide critical edges in low-light shooting scenarios. For Marian, every device presented the same fundamental problem. They weren't designed to work optimally with her thick prescription glasses. Compatibility issues again? The voice belonged to Sergeant First Class Patricia Lopez, the equipment room supervisor who had been quietly observing Marian's prolonged examination of the night vision systems. Lopez was one of the few female instructors in the program, a career soldier whose expertise in optical systems had made her invaluable to the advanced marksmanship training curriculum. Something like that, Marian replied, carefully examining the eyepiece assembly of an ANPVS-14 unit. The eye relief distance doesn't account for corrective lenses, creates gaps that allow ambient light interference, and compromises the image quality. Lopez approached, her professional interest evident. You've been having problems with standard night vision protocols throughout the program. It wasn't a question, and Marian recognized that Lopez had been monitoring her performance issues with the same attention to detail that characterized her approach to equipment management. Yes, Sergeant. The interaction between my glasses and the electronic displays creates depth perception problems that affect accuracy at extended ranges. Interesting problem, Lopez mused, pulling one of the thermal imaging scopes from its storage bracket. Most people assume that night vision technology is universally helpful, but you're dealing with a situation where the solution becomes part of the challenge. She handed the thermal scope to Marian, who immediately noticed its different weight distribution and eye relief characteristics. This is a completely different approach to low-light target acquisition. Instead of amplifying available light, it reads heat signatures and converts them to visual data. Marian examined the scope through her glasses, noting how its design accommodated a wider range of eye positions and distances. The image seems more stable. That's because you're not fighting interference between multiple optical systems, Lopez explained, but there's something else you should understand about this particular piece of equipment. She paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue, something that might interest you from a technical perspective. What's that, Sergeant? Lopez glanced around the equipment room, confirming they were alone. This thermal imaging system was developed by Tesseron Defense Systems as part of a contract for special operations units. The software that processes the thermal data and converts it to targeting information was written by a civilian contractor who specialized in ballistics computation. Marian felt a familiar tingle of recognition. Tesseron Defense Systems was one of the companies her grandfather had consulted for during his post-military career, helping to develop advanced marksmanship techniques and equipment configurations. Do you know who the contractor was? According to the technical documentation, the ballistics algorithms were developed by Thomas Scott, working as an independent consultant. Lopez's expression suggested she understood the significance of the revelation. The same Thomas Scott, whose rifle you've been carrying throughout this program. The implications hit Marian like a physical blow. Her grandfather hadn't just trained her in traditional marksmanship techniques. He had literally helped design the technological systems that represented the cutting edge of military precision shooting. The thermal imaging scope she was holding contained algorithms based on his calculations, his understanding of ballistics, his decades of experience in reading environmental conditions. He never mentioned working on military contracts, Marian said quietly. Probably classified at the time, Lopez replied. But here's the really interesting part. The targeting software in this system doesn't rely primarily on visual accuracy. It processes environmental data, calculates ballistic trajectories, and provides firing solutions based on mathematical models rather than optical precision. She activated the scope, and Marian found herself looking at a display that showed not just heat signatures but wind direction indicators, range calculations, and ballistic correction data overlaid on the thermal image. It's designed for situations where traditional visual references are limited or unreliable. Perfect for extended-range shooting in conditions where standard optics become limitations rather than advantages. Marian stared at the scope display, recognizing calculation methods and environmental factors that were identical to techniques her grandfather had taught her during their summer training sessions. The mathematical relationships, the way multiple variables were integrated into firing solutions, even the user interface logic, it all reflected the systematic approach to precision shooting that had defined her education. Sergeant, this is essentially a computerized version of my grandfather's shooting methodology. That's exactly what it is, Lopez confirmed. Thomas Scott took 40 years of field experience and converted it into software that could provide the same analytical capabilities to soldiers who hadn't spent decades learning to read environmental conditions manually. The revelation was staggering. Marian had been struggling throughout the program because she was being forced to use equipment designed for conventional approaches to marksmanship, while the most advanced system available was based on the exact techniques she had been trained to implement mentally. Her grandfather had literally created the technology that could optimize her unconventional approach to precision shooting. "Why are you telling me this?" Marian asked. Lopez was quiet for a moment, her expression suggesting internal conflict between official protocols and personal convictions. "Because I've been watching your performance throughout this program, and I've seen how equipment limitations have been used to undermine your capabilities." She gestured toward the rows of night vision devices. Every system in this room was designed with certain assumptions about user characteristics and operational requirements. When those assumptions don't match the actual user, the equipment becomes a liability instead of an asset. She activated several different night vision systems, demonstrating the compatibility problems that had been plaguing Marian's performance. But this thermal imaging system was designed by your grandfather specifically to overcome the limitations of conventional optical approaches. It doesn't care whether you have perfect vision. It cares whether you understand the mathematical relationships that determine where bullets go under various conditions. Marian examined the scope more carefully, noting design features that seemed tailored for users who relied on analytical rather than purely visual approaches to target engagement. Will this system be available for the final evaluation? That's where things get complicated, Lopez said, her expression darkening. Officially, candidates are allowed to select from any available night vision system based on their individual preferences and operational requirements. She paused. Unofficially, there's been discussion about limiting the final evaluation to standardized equipment to ensure fair comparison between candidates. The implication was clear. Just as her grandfather's rifle had been questioned despite its superior performance, the thermal imaging system that could optimize her capabilities was being targeted for exclusion from the final test. Who's leading that discussion? Captain Thompson has raised concerns about candidates using specialized equipment that provides unfair advantages over standard military systems. Lopez's tone suggested her opinion of Thompson's motivations. He's argued that elite snipers need to be capable of performing with whatever equipment is available in the field, not dependent on customized solutions. Marian recognized the familiar pattern, legitimate-sounding arguments being used to eliminate her advantages while preserving those of her competitors. Thompson's reasoning would sound reasonable to anyone not familiar with the technical details, but it ignored the fundamental principle that different users require different tools to achieve optimal performance. Sergeant, what's your professional assessment of that argument? Lopez smiled grimly. My professional assessment is that elite snipers use whatever equipment gives them the best chance of mission success. Special operations units carry customized weapons, specialized optics, and whatever technology provides tactical advantages. She gestured around the equipment room. Every piece of gear in this facility represents an attempt to optimize human performance through technological enhancement. Arguing against specialized equipment is like arguing against progress itself. She pulled a technical manual from a nearby shelf, opening it to a section that detailed the thermal imaging system's capabilities. Besides, this isn't really specialized equipment in the way Thompson suggests. It's an advanced version of standard military technology, developed through official contracts and approved for field deployment. Your grandfather's contributions were part of the legitimate research and development process. Marian studied the manual, recognizing formulas and calculation methods that matched her handwritten notes from years of training sessions. So using this system wouldn't violate any regulations? Not only would it not violate regulations, it would actually demonstrate your ability to adapt to and optimize advanced military technology. Lopez closed the manual and returned it to its shelf, which is supposedly one of the primary objectives of this entire program. As they prepared to leave the equipment room, Lopez stopped and looked directly at Marian. Scott, can I give you some advice? Of course, Sergeant. Your grandfather didn't just teach you to shoot, he taught you to think like a systems engineer about precision marksmanship. That's a rare and valuable skill that the military desperately needs. She paused. But some people are threatened by approaches they don't understand, especially when those approaches prove more effective than conventional methods. Lopez activated the thermal scope one final time, showing Marian how its display integrated environmental data with targeting information. The question you need to ask yourself is whether you're going to let their limitations define your capabilities, or whether you're going to use every available tool to demonstrate what you can actually accomplish. As Marian left the equipment room, she carried with her the stunning realization that her grandfather's influence on modern military marksmanship extended far beyond the training he had provided her personally. The very technology that represented the future of precision shooting was based on methods he had developed, and she had spent years perfecting. The final evaluation was no longer just a test of her individual capabilities. It was a confrontation between conventional assumptions about military excellence and her grandfather's revolutionary approach to precision shooting under impossible conditions. And for the first time since arriving at Fort Carson, Marian understood that she possessed advantages her opponents couldn't even imagine. The Colorado mountains were draped in absolute darkness when the candidates assembled for the final evaluation at 0200 hours. No moon, no ambient light, and a thick cloud cover that blocked even starlight, conditions that Master Sergeant Richards described as operationally realistic for special operations deployment. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, adding another layer of complexity to what was already being called the most challenging final test in the program's history. Marian stood at the edge of the assembly area, her grandfather's rifle slung across her shoulder and the thermal imaging scope secured in its protective case. Around her, 23 remaining candidates, the survivors of 3 weeks of brutal selection, checked their equipment with the nervous energy of soldiers preparing for actual combat. The washout rate had been higher than usual, and everyone understood that tonight's performance would determine who earned the elite sniper designation and who returned to their previous assignments. "Gentlemen," Master Sergeant Richards announced, his voice cutting through the mountain air like a blade, "tonight's evaluation will test every skill you've developed during this program. You will engage a single target at a range of 1 mile, 1,760 meters, under conditions of complete darkness. No ambient light, no visual references, no second chances." The distance announcement drew sharp intakes of breath from several candidates. 1 mile represented the absolute edge of what was considered possible for precision rifle shooting, requiring perfect calculation of environmental factors and flawless execution of fundamental marksmanship techniques. In daylight, with optimal conditions, it was a shot that challenged even the most experienced snipers. In complete darkness, it approached the realm of the impossible. Each candidate will have 30 minutes to analyze conditions, prepare their equipment, and engage the target, Richards continued. 1 shot, pass or fail. The candidate with the most precise impact will be designated as the honor graduate of this selection course. Captain Thompson stepped forward, his expression barely visible in the darkness, but his satisfaction evident in his posture. Due to safety concerns and the need for standardized evaluation, all candidates will use identical night vision equipment provided by the program. No personal optics or specialized systems will be permitted. The announcement hit Marian like a physical blow. Thompson's maneuvering had successfully eliminated her access to the thermal imaging system that could have optimized her capabilities. She would be forced to use the same night vision technology that had created compatibility problems throughout her training, while competing against candidates whose vision didn't require the corrective lenses that interfered with electronic displays. Chief Warrant Officer Chen appeared beside her in the darkness, his voice barely audible. "Expected this move, Thompson's been planning it for days," he paused. "But remember what your grandfather taught you about equipment dependency." Marian nodded, recalling countless lessons about the difference between tools and capabilities. Thomas Scott had always emphasized that excellent marksmen adapted to their equipment rather than being limited by it. "The shot is made in the mind," she whispered, repeating one of his favorite maxims. "Exactly." Chen moved away before his extended presence could draw attention, but his brief encouragement had reminded Marian of principles that transcended technology. The candidates were called forward in random order to receive their standardized night vision equipment and firing positions. Marian drew position 12, located between Staff Sergeant Morrison and a Special Forces candidate named Rodriguez, who had maintained respectful distance throughout the program. As she approached the equipment table, she noticed Thompson's barely concealed smile as he personally handed her the night vision device. "Good luck tonight, Scott," he said with false sincerity. "May the best shooter win." The night vision system was a standard AN/PVS-14 monocular device, identical to the equipment that had caused her problems during training exercises. As she adjusted the device over her thick glasses, the familiar issues immediately became apparent. Gaps between her prescription lenses and the electronic display that allowed ambient light interference, compromised depth perception, and reduced image clarity that made precise aiming significantly more difficult. But as she settled into her firing position, Marian began implementing techniques her grandfather had taught her for situations where equipment limitations threatened mission success. Instead of fighting the technology, she began using it as one input among many for understanding the environment between her position and the distant target. The 1-mile target was completely invisible through conventional optics, existing only as GPS coordinates and theoretical location data provided by the range officials. Through the night vision scope, it appeared as a faint geometric shape against the darker background, wavering and distorting as atmospheric conditions affected the electronic image. For most candidates, the night vision device would provide their primary source of targeting information. For Marian, it became a tool for environmental analysis rather than precise aiming. She removed her notebook, her grandfather's detailed observations about long-range shooting under various conditions, and began calculating the environmental factors that would affect her bullet's flight path. Temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and most critically, wind patterns that she could detect through subtle changes in the night vision display as air currents moved through the darkness. "Time check, 20 minutes remaining," announced one of the range officials. Around her, other candidates were making final adjustments to their equipment and settling into their shooting positions. The tension was palpable as each man prepared for the shot that would define his military career. Marian closed her eyes and began the mental process her grandfather had called seeing with the mind. She visualized the bullet's trajectory across 1,760 meters of mountain air, calculating the precise arc required to account for gravity, wind drift, and the temperature-induced changes in powder burn rate that would affect muzzle velocity. The mathematics were complex, but they had become as natural to her as breathing through years of practice. When she opened her eyes and looked through the night vision scope, the image quality problems remained unchanged. The target was still a wavering, indistinct shape that provided insufficient detail for precise aiming. But her mental calculations had given her something more valuable than visual clarity. They had given her certainty about where the bullet needed to go. 15 minutes, came the next time announcement. Staff Sergeant Morrison, shooting from the position to her left, was struggling with his own equipment. She could hear him muttering curses as he attempted to achieve a stable sight picture through his night vision device. "Impossible conditions," he said quietly. "Can't even see the damn target clearly enough to aim." His complaint reflected the challenge facing every candidate on the firing line. They were all dealing with the same equipment limitations, the same visual restrictions, and the same impossibly demanding shot requirements. The difference was that Marian had spent her entire life preparing for situations where conventional approaches failed. She made her final scope adjustments based on her calculations rather than visual references, setting windage and elevation corrections that compensated for conditions she understood mathematically rather than could see clearly. Her breathing slowed to the controlled rhythm her grandfather had taught her, and her trigger finger found the precise position that would deliver consistent pressure. 10 minutes remaining. Captain Thompson had positioned himself where he could observe multiple firing positions, his night vision device focused on the candidates he considered most likely to succeed. When his observation swept across Marian's position, she was motionless behind her rifle, her thick glasses reflecting the faint green glow of her night vision scope. "Scott looks locked up," Thompson commented to another instructor, "probably paralyzed by the conditions. Some people just can't handle this level of pressure." But Marian wasn't paralyzed. She was calculating. Her mind processed the final variables. The slight temperature drop that had occurred during the 30-minute preparation period. The subtle shift in wind direction she had detected through changes in the night vision display, and the precise holdover required to compensate for the extreme range. 5 minutes. She opened her grandfather's notebook one final time, confirming the calculations that would guide her shot. On the last page, she found a note written in his careful handwriting that seemed intended for exactly this moment. "When you cannot see the target clearly, aim for where you know it must be. Trust the mathematics, trust your training, and trust that excellence transcends the limits others accept." 2 minutes. Prepare to fire. Marian settled into her final shooting position, her body alignment optimized for the recoil characteristics of her grandfather's rifle. Through the night vision scope, the target remained a vague, wavering shape that defied precise aim point selection. But in her mind, she could see it with perfect clarity, exactly 1,760 meters away, positioned precisely where her calculations indicated it would be. 1 minute. Stand by. The firing line fell silent, except for the controlled breathing of 23 candidates preparing for the most important shot of their military careers. Each man was dealing with the same impossible conditions, the same equipment limitations, and the same pressure to perform when failure meant the end of elite aspirations. But only one of them had been trained by Thomas Scott to succeed when success seemed impossible. "Commence firing. You have 1 shot." The sound of rifles began echoing across the mountain valley as candidates engaged the invisible target that would determine their fate. Some shots came quickly, fired by men who hoped speed would overcome uncertainty. Others were delayed, as shooters struggled to achieve confidence in conditions that defied conventional marksmanship techniques. Marian waited, her breathing controlled and her mind clear. She was the 12th shooter in sequence, but she would take her shot when her calculations indicated optimal conditions, not when pressure demanded immediate action. The moment came 30 seconds later, a subtle shift in the night air that told her the wind patterns had stabilized according to her environmental analysis. She applied steady pressure to the trigger, feeling the familiar brake that released her grandfather's rifle to send its bullet across a mile of Colorado darkness toward a target she couldn't see but knew with absolute certainty she would hit. The recoil pushed back against her shoulder as the bullet began its 3-second journey through the night. Around her, other candidates and instructors waited with spotting scopes and electronic monitoring equipment to determine the impact location. But Marian already knew where her bullet had gone. It had followed the precise trajectory her calculations had predicted, compensating for every environmental variable and equipment limitation that had been used throughout the program to undermine her capabilities. For the first time in 3 weeks, she allowed herself to smile. The silence that followed Marian's shot seemed to stretch for eternity. 23 candidates and a dozen instructors waited in absolute darkness as range officials used electronic monitoring equipment to determine impact locations on the mile-distant target. The only sounds were the whispered conversations of spotters confirming readings and the occasional metallic click of equipment being adjusted. Master Sergeant Richard stood beside the primary monitoring station, a tablet displaying GPS coordinates and impact data glowing softly in his hands. His expression was unreadable as he scrolled through the results, cross-referencing multiple measurement systems to ensure accuracy. Chief Warrant Officer Chen positioned himself nearby, his own monitoring equipment providing independent verification of the electronic scoring systems. "Impact confirmation on target number 7, announced Sergeant Lopez from her position at the secondary monitoring station. Distance from center 4.2 inches. Candidate Morrison. A collective exhale rose from the candidates as Morrison's respectable shot established the initial benchmark. 4 inches from center at 1 mile represented exceptional marksmanship under any conditions, but particularly impressive given the complete darkness and standardized equipment requirements. Target 12 shows impact, came another announcement. Distance from center 2.8 inches. Candidate Rodriguez. The Special Forces operator had delivered a shot that improved significantly on Morrison's performance, drawing murmurs of appreciation from the assembled group. Rodriguez maintained his position behind his rifle, his professional composure masking what must have been intense satisfaction with his performance. Captain Thompson moved among the monitoring stations, checking results with barely concealed anxiety. His confident demeanor from earlier in the evening had been replaced by something approaching nervousness, as the electronic systems revealed performance levels that exceeded his expectations. Several candidates had delivered shots that demonstrated remarkable precision under impossible conditions. Target 15 confirms impact, Lopez continued. Distance from center, 1.9 inches. Candidate Williams. Staff Sergeant Williams had somehow managed to place his bullet less than 2 inches from perfect center, a shot that would have been remarkable under ideal conditions and bordered on miraculous given the circumstances. The big man's earlier skepticism about Marian's capabilities seemed irrelevant now, as all attention focused on performance rather than preconceptions. Richards looked up from his tablet, his voice carrying across the firing line with military precision. Outstanding shooting across the board tonight. These results represent some of the finest marksmanship I've witnessed in 8 years of running this program. He paused, consulting his data again. However, we have one impact that requires additional verification due to the precision of the measurement. The announcement created immediate tension among the candidates. Additional verification usually meant either a complete miss that couldn't be located, or a shot so accurate that multiple measurement systems were needed to confirm the result. Target 23 shows an impact that our primary monitoring system initially flagged as potentially erroneous, Richards continued. Chief Chen, can you confirm your independent readings? Chen stepped forward, his own tablet displaying data that had been collected through separate monitoring equipment. Primary monitoring system shows impact distance of 0.04 inches from absolute center. Secondary system confirms 0.03 inches. Tertiary measurement using physical inspection indicates 0.02 inches from mathematical center. The numbers hit the assembled group like physical blows. 0.02 inches from center represented a level of precision that approached the theoretical limits of equipment accuracy. At 1 mile distance, in complete darkness, using standardized equipment, someone had delivered a shot that was essentially perfect. "Target 23, Richards announced, his voice carrying a note of professional awe. "Candidate Scott." The silence that followed was absolute. 22 candidates, a dozen instructors and range officials stared into the darkness toward Marian's firing position, trying to process the impossibility of what they had just heard. The slight woman with thick glasses who had been dismissed as a diversity hire had just delivered the most precise shot in the program's history. Captain Thompson stood frozen beside the monitoring station, his tablet displaying the same unbelievable measurements that confirmed his complete miscalculation of Marian's capabilities. "That's impossible," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "Equipment malfunction, measurement error, something." Chief Chen approached Thompson with the calm authority of someone delivering unwelcome news to a superior officer. "Captain, I've verified the measurements through 3 independent systems. Additionally, physical inspection of the target confirms bullet impact 0.02 inches from mathematical center." He paused. "There's no equipment malfunction. There's no measurement error. Candidate Scott just delivered a perfect shot under conditions that most experienced snipers would consider impossible." The implications began sinking in among the candidates who had spent 3 weeks dismissing Marian as an unqualified participant in their elite program. Staff Sergeant Morrison, who had openly questioned her presence, stared toward her position with something approaching disbelief. "How?" he asked quietly. "How is that even possible?" Marian rose from her firing position, her grandfather's rifle secured across her shoulder and her thick glasses reflecting the faint glow of monitoring equipment. For the first time since arriving at Fort Carson, she walked toward the center of the group with complete confidence, no longer the outsider seeking acceptance, but the undisputed champion of their most demanding test. "Mathematics," she said simply, echoing her response to similar questions throughout the program. "My grandfather taught me that precision shooting is applied physics. If you understand the variables and calculate correctly, the results are predictable." Master Sergeant Richards approached her with the expression of someone reevaluating fundamental assumptions. "Scott, can you explain how you achieved that level of accuracy using the same equipment and conditions as every other candidate?" Marian opened her grandfather's notebook, the pages filled with decades of accumulated wisdom about precision shooting under extreme conditions. The night vision equipment everyone focused on was just one tool for gathering environmental information. "I used it to detect wind patterns, temperature variations, and atmospheric conditions rather than trying to aim visually at a target I couldn't see clearly." She showed them pages of calculations that had guided her shot preparation. Wind speed and direction every 50 meters between here and the target. Temperature gradients that affect bullet trajectory. Barometric pressure changes that influence powder burn rates. All of it can be measured and calculated if you know what to look for. Sergeant Lopez examined the calculations with professional fascination. "These formulas, they're the same ballistics algorithms used in the thermal imaging system your grandfather helped develop." "He taught me to do manually what advanced technology does electronically," Marian confirmed. "The advantage isn't in the equipment. It's in understanding the physics well enough that you don't depend on technology to think for you." Captain Thompson struggled to maintain his composure as the full scope of his miscalculation became apparent. "This was an aberration," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "One lucky shot under specific conditions doesn't prove general competence." Chief Chen stepped forward with the authority of senior rank and combat experience. "Captain, with respect, 0.02 inches at 1 mile isn't luck. It's the result of superior preparation, advanced technical knowledge, and exceptional execution under extreme pressure." He gestured toward the monitoring data. "This shot represents exactly the kind of capability this program is designed to identify and develop." The transformation in group dynamics was immediate and complete. Candidates who had participated in harassment campaigns found themselves studying Marian with grudging respect. Instructors who had questioned her qualifications were forced to acknowledge that she had demonstrated abilities that exceeded their own expectations and experience. Rodriguez, the Special Forces operator whose own shot had been impressive, approached Marian with professional curiosity. "Scott, would you be willing to share some of your calculation techniques? I've never seen environmental analysis applied that systematically to long-range shooting." "Of course," Marian replied, her earlier isolation replaced by the respect due to demonstrated excellence. "My grandfather always said knowledge was meant to be shared with people serious about the craft." As the candidates began loading equipment for transport back to the main facility, Master Sergeant Richards pulled Marian aside for a private conversation. "Scott, in 8 years of running this program, I've never seen anything like tonight's performance. Your final score, combined with your overall training results, makes you the honor graduate of this selection course." He handed her a certificate and distinctive badge that designated her as an elite military sniper, qualified for the most demanding precision shooting missions. "But more than that, you've demonstrated an approach to marksmanship that could revolutionize how we train future snipers. Would you be interested in remaining here as an instructor after your initial assignment?" Marian looked at the badge in her hands, remembering the doubts and dismissals she had faced throughout the program. "I'd be honored, Master Sergeant." 6 months later, the Marian Scott Advanced Marksmanship Program had become the most requested specialty training in the military. Her techniques for environmental analysis and mathematical approaches to precision shooting were being adopted by special operations units worldwide. The methods her grandfather had developed in Vietnam were now standard curriculum for elite snipers. Captain Thompson had been quietly transferred to a different assignment, his evaluation reports noting difficulties with adaptive leadership and assessment of personnel capabilities. The systematic harassment that had defined Marian's early experience led to policy changes throughout the military's advanced training programs. Chief Chen often told new instructor candidates about the night a slight woman with thick glasses had delivered the most precise shot in program history, proving that excellence could emerge from the most unexpected sources. "She couldn't see the target clearly," he would explain, "but she understood it perfectly. Sometimes that makes all the difference." Marian kept her grandfather's notebook on her desk in the instructor facility, its pages now supplemented with her own observations about teaching precision shooting to soldiers who had learned to look beyond surface appearances. On quiet evenings, she would read Thomas Scott's final entry, written shortly before his death. "Marian girl, the world will try to tell you what you can't do based on what they think they see, but they don't know what we know, that the most dangerous shooters are the ones who understand what others miss." The mile-long shot in pitch black had proved him right. And every student who learned to see with their minds instead of just their eyes carried that lesson forward into a military that had finally learned to recognize excellence in all its forms. In the end, perfect vision had nothing to do with perfect sight. It was about understanding that limitations were just another variable to calculate, overcome, and transform into advantages that others never saw coming. The target had been 1,760 meters away in absolute darkness. But the real distance covered was measured in minds changed, barriers broken, and a legacy of precision that would influence military marksmanship for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.